Section 9 of Great Events in the History of North and South America. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Great Events in the History of North and South America by Charles Goodrich. Middle and Southern Settlements. The settlement of the state of New York commenced in 1613, so far as the erection of a fort near the present city of Albany, and a few trading houses on the island of Manhattan, New York, may be said to constitute a settlement. The Dutch founded their claim to the soil from the discovery of the Hudson by an Englishman of that name, who was then in the employ of the Dutch. But the British king disputed the claim from the fact of the previous discovery of the country by the Cabots. The Dutch were forced for a short time to yield to the demands of the English, but the colony having increased in the course of a year, the English were required in their turn to yield their authority to the original occupants. For a series of years the latter continued in peaceful possession, and by characteristic toil and perseverance secured the blessings of a growing settlement. The territory on both sides of the Hudson occupied by the settlers was called New Netherlands. In defence of their colony, in 1623, they built several forts, one on the east side of Delaware Bay, which they named Nassau, and another 150 miles up the river, which they called Aurania. At the mouth of the river they built a town, to which they gave the name of New Amsterdam, afterwards New York. Near Fort Nassau the Swedes had a settlement, and from the interfering claims of the two people quarrels arose, which in a few years ended in the subjugation of the Swedes. In consequence of the Dutch claims so far to the eastward, difficulties frequently arose between them and the Connecticut and New Haven colonies, but these never amounted to another rupture, and the Dutch were occasionally assisted in the Indian warfare by their more courageous neighbours. At the accession of Charles II to the British throne, the province of New Netherlands passed into the hands of the English. As the king, by a charter, had conveyed the whole territory to his brother, the Duke of York and Albany, he undertook to effect his object by force, and accordingly dispatched an armament under the command of Colonel Nichols, who was also appointed governor of the province. The exhibition of force was the means of effecting a treaty of capitulation on the part of Stuyvesant, the Dutch governor. From this time New Amsterdam and the whole conquered province received the name of New York, the original settlers choosing for the most part to remain, and being permitted to adopt many of their own forms of government. New Jersey was settled by the Dutch, not long after they had fixed themselves on the Hudson River. The Danes also commenced a settlement at a place to which they gave the name Bergen. This was about the year 1624. In 1626 a company of Swedes and Finns purchased land on both sides of Delaware River, and commenced a settlement on the western bank. The Dutch, however, considering themselves as the original settlers, laid claim to the country. They had built a fort as early as 1623 on the east bank of the South River, as the Delaware was then called. It was not until the year 1640 that the English made any attempt to colonize the territory in question, and then they were resisted and expelled by the Swedes and Dutch. A few years afterwards, however, the Duke of York granted New Jersey to John, Lord Berkeley, and Sir George Carteret, the territory receiving that name in compliment to Sir George, who had been governor of the island of Jersey in the English Channel. Carteret soon after arrived at Elizabethtown, which he made the seat of government. The state of Delaware was originally settled by the Dutch and Swedes, the former as early as 1629, having purchased a tract of land near Cape Henlopen. The enterprise of planting a colony on the Delaware was entrusted to an experienced navigator, De Vries, and in 1630 an association was formed for this purpose, in pursuance of which a settlement was made the next spring, on the west side of the river, at a place since called Lewiston. The Swedes also made considerable settlements on the same side of the river, but whether these preceded that of the Dutch is considered doubtful, the more recent authorities leaning rather to the Dutch claim. The Swedes, however, whatever their pretensions may have been, were conquered by the Dutch, in whose possession the country remained until the surrender of New York in 1664. It was immediately after taken possession of for the Duke of York by Sir Robert Carr. A portion of its subsequent history is included in that of Pennsylvania, as Delaware had not even an assembly separate from that of Pennsylvania for several years. Settlements commenced in Maryland as early as 1634. 2 or 3 years previously, Lord Baltimore had visited the colony of Virginia, and observing that the Virginians had formed no settlement to the northward of the river Potomac, he determined to procure a grant of territory in that region. But he died before the necessary authority by charter, which Charles had promised, could be given him. The patent, however, was filled up for his son Cornelius Calvert, who had then become Lord Baltimore. The king gave to the new province the name of Maryland in honour of his queen, Henrietta Maria. It was originally included in the patent of the South Virginia Company, a circumstance which gave rise for a time to disputes and difficulties between these communities. Lord Baltimore pursued a wise course in forming his colony. He established a basis of security to property and of freedom to religion, bestowing in absolute fee 50 acres of land on every emigrant, and allowing toleration to the various sects of the Christian faith. George Calvert, the brother of the governor, arrived with the first colony, consisting of about 200 Roman Catholics from England. Calvert, by kindness and liberality, obtained possession of an Indian town of importance, to which he gave the name of St. Mary's. Lord Baltimore was constituted the proprietor of the province, and he and his descendants, with some years of interruption, continued to enjoy the rights of jurisdiction and property until the time of the Revolution. Then the people, having adopted a constitution, refused to admit the claims of the representatives of Lord Baltimore. The charter, embracing what is now North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, was granted by Charles II in 1662 to Edward, Earl of Clarendon, George, Duke of Albemarle, William, Lord Craven, and several others. This country was called Florida, and claimed by the Spaniards. The claim, nevertheless, was supposed to be relinquished by the stipulations of a treaty between Great Britain and Spain in 1667. The previous efforts to colonize this portion of the American continent had been unsuccessful, and grants that had been given to the different individuals were now pronounced by the Privy Council to be null and void. A government was organized over the few settlers that were scattered in different parts, Mr. Drummond having been appointed governor. The settlers on Albemarle Sound were allowed, on certain conditions, to retain their lands. The proprietors of the Carolinas did not make serious effort towards adding to the number of the colonists until 1667. 2 ships carried out a number of adventurers, with provisions, arms, and utensils necessary for building and cultivation. Sale was appointed governor in 1669. In what place he first landed is uncertain, but not being pleased with his situation, he moved to the southward and took possession of a neck of land between Ashley and Cooper rivers. Here he laid out a town, which in honour of the British king he called Charleston. This was the origin of South Carolina, as distinguished from North Carolina. The distance between Albemarle and the new location induced the proprietors to establish two separate governments, the settlements on the Sound constituting North Carolina. The early existence of the northern colony is said to have been marked in a sad degree by confusion and misrule, owing mainly to the exceptional nature of its fundamental constitutions. Georgia, though the last of the English colonies established in North America, may be mentioned here, since it was included in the original grant with the Carolinas. The charter of Georgia as a district was granted in 1732, and embraced the country on the south of the Carolinas, between the rivers Savannah and Altamaha, and extended westward from the heads of these rivers to the South Sea. It was given to 21 persons, who were wealthy and influential individuals, as trustees, who were incorporated for the purpose of settling and establishing the colony. In pursuance of this design, in 1733 James Oglethorpe embarked for the province with 116 persons destined for settlement. He selected the present site of Savannah as the most desirable spot for this object. Here he built a fort, and put the colony in a proper state of defence, not neglecting in the meantime to cultivate friendly relations with the Indians. Though the objects of the settlement of Georgia were in great measure benevolent, as they contemplated among other things an asylum for the poor and wretched in England and Ireland, yet the hopes of prosperity entertained by the trustees were not a little disappointed. The expenditures necessary for the support of the colony became at length very onerous. The colony also was disturbed by the hostility of the Spaniards on the south, and nothing under divine providence but the wise counsels and determined valour of General Oglethorpe saved it from destruction in the early part of its existence. The tract of country west of the Delaware was in 1681 granted to William Penn, son of the distinguished Admiral Penn, as a reward for the services of his father. The boundaries of the tract are definitely given us in the charter, but are too minute to be here specified. The whole region was afterwards called Pennsylvania, constituting a state of very large and regular dimensions. The origin of the name is beautifully and ingeniously accounted for in a letter written by William Penn. "This day, January the 5th, 1681, says he, after many waitings, watchings, solicitings, and disputes in the council, my country was confirmed to me under the Great Seal of England, with large powers and privileges, by the name of Pennsylvania, a name the king would give it in honour of my father. I chose New Wales, being a hilly country, and when the secretary, a Welshman, refused to call it New Wales, I proposed Sylvania, and they added Penn to it, though I much opposed it, and went to the king to have it struck out. He said 'twas past, and he would take it upon him, nor could 20 guineas move the under secretary to vary the name, for I feared it would be looked on as a vanity in me, and not as a respect in the king to my father, as it really was. Thou mayest communicate my grant to friends, and expect shortly my proposals. 'Tis a dear and just thing, and my God, that has given it to me through many difficulties, will, I believe, bless and make it the seed of a nation. I shall have a tender care to the government that it be well laid at first. And it was well laid. The territory was peaceably and by fair purchase procured of the natives, and though difficulties occasionally existed in the government, which gave the proprietor considerable concern, yet the colony enjoyed a career of prosperity for several successive years. The effects of his magnanimity and justice were especially visible in the early history of the colony. Such, as briefly reviewed, is the history of the original settlements of the old 13 United States. The character of the settlers, as well as their circumstances, were various. They were from different nations in the Old World, though the great majority were of direct English descent. But amidst the variety there is a degree of uniformity. A similar basis of institutions and principles has obtained, and they have admirably coalesced in forming and sustaining one and a general government, amid their several distinct state organizations, a government admirable for its simplicity, freedom, exact equipoise, and liberal compromises. The number of states is now more than doubled, and ere long will probably be threefold. Through the divine blessing, let it be perpetual. End of section 9.